Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our story here on Alexander the Great. In part 1, we talked about Philip II, Alexander's father, and how he created this really great army from Macedonia, which then moved in and conquered Greece. Philip then wanted to take over the Persians, but unfortunately he got a little disease called knife and chest disease and was stabbed to death and killed. That's going to bring Alexander to power, and Alexander is going to take that great army that he inherited from his father, and he is going to use it to great success. So that's what we're going to talk about here with Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great comes to power when he's very, very young, but he's been trained. He studied under Aristotle. He's read books on war. He fought alongside his father. He's ready, and he's going to do some great things with his army. So let's talk about Alexander the Great. Alexander takes over at the age of 20 after the death of his father, Philip II. Like I said, he was taught by Aristotle. He had learned science, geography, literature, but he was also very well versed in warfare and was definitely ready to lead his army. It was said that Alexander enjoyed Homer's descriptions of the heroic deeds of Achilles during the Trojan Wars. And you have to think about it. If you play a sport today, chances are pretty good there's some athlete you look up to. When I was growing up, it was Michael Jordan. Today, LeBron James' name gets thrown out there a lot. So, there's always some type of role model to look up to. And that was true back during the time of Alexander the Great. Now, Achilles may not have actually existed, but the stories of him would have made for a great role model in terms of a warrior to look up to for Alexander. So, Achilles was sort of the role model for Alexander the Great. One of the stories of the early part of Alexander's reign here is an interesting one. So, he had killed 6,000 Thebans in a rebellion. There was a bunch of Greeks who essentially weren't ready to accept Alexander as their leader. And this revolt was occurring, and so Alexander basically rounded up 6,000 of them and had them killed. Now, there's more to this story, and you can certainly research it on your own, but that cruelty frightened the Greeks into accepting Alexander as their leader. You have to remember, the Greeks are always this collection of city-states, and they were finally conquered by Alexander's father, Philip II. But I just want to make sure we understand that this is not indicative of who Alexander was. He was not a murderer. He was not one who used cruelty to make people follow him. But it is an essential early part of his story here as he becomes the leader of Greece. Now, I'd mentioned the Oracle in the previous part of this video. Again, the Oracle it's a place at Delphi, and people would go visit there and basically ask the Oracle questions and try to get kind of like a look into a crystal ball or a magic 8-ball kind of thing. Try to get some information about the future. And so what the Oracle said to Alexander is Alexander wanted confirmation that he would conquer the world. The Oracle refused to see Alexander. So he grabbed the Oracle Pythia by the hair, which was one of the young girls who would have spoken for the gods at the Oracle at Delphi, and he dragged her out of the temple. She screamed, "Let go of me, you are invincible," and that was all he needed. He said, "Now I have my answer." So it's just an interesting little part of his story. And having been there, it's just cool to know that Alexander stood on the same property that I would visit later, much years later. So this is kind of a cool little part of this story. Now, Alexander's going to set his sight on Persia. And so what we're going to look at here specifically is how he defeats the Persians. He's going to do it step by step. And that's what I'm going to walk you through here. You have to remember, Philip wanted to conquer Persia, but he never had the chance. He was killed before he had the opportunity to move his army across the sea to Persia. So Alexander's going to take 35,000 troops into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. This was Persian-controlled territory. And he's going to meet 40,000 Persians at the Battle of Granicus River. That's a pretty even match. It's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. And what Alexander's army gets really good at doing is attacking swiftly and breaking the enemy. So Alexander's army attacks first, and he breaks the enemy line. He's able to kind of divide and conquer, and he's victorious. Well, Darius the Third is now the ruler of Persia. He's not the Darius we've studied. This is a descendant. So Darius the Third is going to respond with an army of 50 to 75,000, depending on the source you read. Here again, Alexander is going to use his soldiers with those pikes and his cavalry as soldiers on horseback. He's going to break through the Persian weak point, and Darius sees the writing on the wall. He knows if he stays and fights, he will lose, likely even be killed himself, so he flees and runs away. When the dust settles, what this means for Alexander is he now has control of Anatolia, which is a big chunk of the Persian Empire. He doesn't control all of Persia yet. He's working his way to that, but he's taking Persia piece by piece. So starting here with Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The next place that Alexander goes is Egypt. And we heard about this in Engineering and Empire, if you've seen that video. So in 332 BC, Alexander marches into Persian-controlled Egypt. He expects there to be a big fight. His soldiers are ready, and there are no Persians there to fight him. He's welcomed by the Egyptians as a liberator. They even crown him pharaoh. They've heard the stories of Alexander. They know what a great leader he is, even at his young age. And they basically say, come on in, we want you to rule us. And he takes this. I mean, he's more than happy to be deified as a god and worshipped as a pharaoh, all adding to his legacy. I mean, Alexander, basically throughout his life, is victorious every step of the way, and he's going to live his life that way. So as a result of this, Alexander now has control of Egypt. So he's got Anatolia, he's got Egypt, which are both parts of the Persian Empire. Don't forget, he still has Macedonia, and he has all of Greece, because his father conquered Greece. So his territory is quite large at this point. But he still doesn't have all of Persia. So what he's going to do next is he's going to go for the heart of the Persian Empire, and that's Mesopotamia. This is the Tigris and Euphrates River. This is really where the Persians' base of operation was from. So Alexander and his army meet the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela. 250,000 Persians were under Darius's control. Remember, Alexander's got maybe 35,000, 40,000 troops here. But Alexander's got the better tactics. Tactics can always win you battles, even when you're outnumbered. So Alexander launched a massive phalanx attack, followed by his cavalry charge, and just like we've seen before, the Persian lines crumbled. Again, Darius recognizes that this is not a fight he's going to win. He knows how talented Alexander and his troops are, and Darius flees and runs away in battle. This is a big moment, because the result of this battle gives Alexander control of the rest of the Persian Empire. If you have Mesopotamia, you've already got Egypt, and you've already got Anatolia, you control the territory that used to be controlled by the Persians. So Alexander now has control of all the Persian Empire. He had to do it piece by piece. I mean, his empire is massive. We see over here on the western side, he's got Macedonia, he's got Greece, he's got Anatolia, he's got Egypt. Now he's just taken Mesopotamia, and he's going to keep moving east all the way to India. His empire was enormous. So, other conquests. Well, he travels east to India, and it's interesting. He finds out along this way that Darius III had been murdered by his own troops. And this saddens Alexander. Alexander actually goes to Darius's gravesite, and it's said he breaks down and weeps. Some say that's because he wanted to kill Darius himself. Others just say he's sad that his enemy is dead, but either way, he visits Darius's gravesite. What Alexander does here is as he's getting closer to India, he's encouraging his men, like, let's keep going, guys. There's unclaimed territory out here. There's monsters out here that we need to fight and attack. And what he meant by monsters, of course, were elephants. None of the Macedonian troops had ever seen an elephant before, so this would have, of course, been a wild thing to see. And so he's all pumped to take his men further east into India, and his men stop and they say no. In fact, there's a great scene in the film Alexander, which came out in 2004, that shows this. And Alexander's stunned. He's really shocked that his men would disagree with him. After all, Alexander fought alongside his men. He didn't just stand in the background and give orders. He was out there on his horse, a part of the battle, and his men loved him for it. But they had been traveling with him for a very long time. His soldiers were exhausted. They had been traveling for over 11 years. They had covered 11,000 miles, and they wanted to go home. This was seen as a mutiny by Alexander. A mutiny is when your subjects basically overrule you and try to go against your orders, essentially. And so he did have some of his soldiers rounded up and killed. But he eventually understood that, yes, there's plenty of time to take India, so they do turn around and go back home. And it's on this voyage home that Alexander becomes very ill and passes away. So Alexander dies from illness at the age of 32. He's quite young. And there's lots of theories about his death. Some say he drank himself to death. Some say it was illness. There's even rumors that he could have been poisoned. I mean, we don't really know what happened. And it makes you wonder, had he lived to be 50 or 60 years old, what would have been the extent of his empire? How much of land would he have truly conquered? It's a what-if in history that we can't ever answer, of course. But he does die young. So Alexander dies, and we have to really look at his legacy and wonder, why will he be remembered? What's going to happen next? So a couple of things to point out here. I mean, he was definitely an amazing general. Yes, he inherited that great army from his father, but he also used it and was successful every single step of the way. Up until the point when he died, he had not tasted defeat. He was victorious everywhere he went. So he was an amazing general who conquered a vast area. He definitely spread Greek culture everywhere he went. He and his father both believed in the Greek culture, even though they were Macedonian, and they spread that culture to all different territories of his empire. So they built several Alexandrias, and in these Alexandrias you would have seen Greek theaters. You would have seen Greek gymnasiums. People would have spoke the Greek language. It was this celebration of Greek culture that he was bringing with him everywhere he went. And naturally, you're going to have that blend with the native culture that's already there. And so one of the great legacies of Alexander is Hellenism. Hellenism is a blending of Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Macedonian, and Indian influences. And really, that's our scorecard, right? I mean, he's from Macedonia. He and his father conquer Greece. They conquer Persia, and part of Persia included Egypt, and they make it all the way over to just part of India. And so all those cultures blend together. You can go to those areas today, and you can see Greek amphitheaters. You can see Greek pottery and things that should have never Greek items that should have never been there because they certainly aren't a part of Greece. But he brought them with him, and he certainly made them take on new items of these different cultures. So that blending of culture is called Hellenistic culture or Hellenism. It's a blending of Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Macedonian, Indian influences. So he spread Greek culture to all of his conquered territories. So again, here's where he was from, Macedonia. They took over Greece. He moved over to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Then he took Egypt. Then he took Mesopotamia, and he made it all the way over pretty much to the edge of India. So that is what we have from Alexander's empire. One of the most remarkable things, we said he built a lot of Alexandrias, is the Alexandria in Egypt. And those of you who have seen Engineering Empire, you know a little bit about this city. It was a center for trade, but there were two items that really made it stand out. First is the 350-foot lighthouse. It was the first ever of its kind, first ever built. Now, it doesn't exist anymore. An earthquake brought it down, but we do have lots of different evidence to point to its existence, so we know it was real. And the other thing that existed within Alexandria was a library that had 250,000 scrolls. So one of the first places where we see learning becoming a commodity. We had talked about that with the library at Nineveh under the Assyrians, but basically ships would come into the harbor at Alexandria, and they were asked to turn over any documents that they had. And the scribes in the library at Alexandria would make a copy of those documents, and then they'd actually hand back the copies and keep the originals. The library did burn, so it does not exist anymore, but it's another one of those things that we know existed based on the documentation. If any of you have played any of the Assassin's Creed games, specifically Assassin's Creed Origins, Alexandria is a prominently featured city in that game, and you can go both to the library and climb the lighthouse. So I love those games. So that brings us to the end here. Alexander the Great, he was a big deal. So through Philip II's and Alexander's conquest of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Persians, ideas would spread and cultures would combine in a way that had never been seen before. After Alexander's death, the Greek civilization would gradually decline until many of their achievements and ideas would be absorbed into perhaps the greatest example of Hellenism in history, the Roman Empire. And of course, Rome is going to be our next unit that we're going to study here in world history. So that's going to do it for us here on Alexander. We can come back to our constructive response question that says, trace the development of Alexander the Great and his accomplishments. And we have lots of great information here to answer that one. And when I say trace the development, I'm talking about really kind of describe his story. You'd certainly want to probably start with talking about Philip II, but focus on Alexander and how he defeats the Persians. Maybe talk about his cavalry and infantry, and certainly you want to talk about Hellenism as one of the great legacies of Alexander the Great. So, that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.